And I hope the children have enjoyed it too, because they might learn something from it as well.
A document has just emerged from Buckingham Palace that changes everything we thought we knew about Queen Elizabeth's final days. After more than 3 years of carefully managed narratives, the truth about what really happened at Balmoral in September 2022 is finally coming to light. The cover-up is unraveling. The revelation. The package arrived at the offices of The Guardian newspaper on the morning of December 5, 2025, delivered by courier with no return address. Inside was a flash drive containing scanned copies of medical records, internal palace memoranda, and handwritten notes that appeared to document the final days of Queen Elizabeth II. The journalist who opened the package, a veteran royal correspondent named Sarah Mitchell, recognized immediately that if these documents were authentic, they represented one of the most significant leaks in modern royal history. Mitchell spent the next 6 hours verifying the documents with medical experts, comparing handwriting samples, cross-referencing dates and times with known events, and attempting to confirm details through confidential sources within the palace structure. By mid-afternoon, she was convinced. The documents were real, and they told a story that was dramatically different from what the British public and the world had been told about the Queen's death on September 8, 2022. The official death certificate, made public shortly after the Queen's passing, had listed the cause of death simply as old age. It was a term that conveyed dignity and naturalness, the sense of a life fully lived coming to its appointed end. The palace statements had emphasized that Her Majesty had died peacefully at Balmoral, surrounded by family, after a period of declining health that was expected given her advanced age of 96. The narrative had been one of gentle closure, a beloved monarch slipping away quietly at her cherished Scottish estate. But the medical records on the flash drive told a different story entirely. They documented a medical crisis that had unfolded over the final 72 hours of the Queen's life, a crisis that involved emergency interventions, desperate attempts at stabilization, and ultimately a death that was far from the peaceful passing that had been described. The cause of death listed in these internal medical documents was not old age but acute organ failure following a severe stroke, compounded by previously undisclosed cardiac issues. The documents revealed that Queen Elizabeth had suffered a major stroke on the evening of September 5th, 3 days before her death. The stroke had been catastrophic, leaving her largely unresponsive and requiring immediate intensive medical intervention. A team of doctors had been summoned to Balmoral, medical equipment had been rushed to the estate, and for the next 72 hours the Queen had been kept alive through medical support while her family was urgently contacted and told to come immediately. What made the revelation even more explosive was the evidence of a coordinated effort to conceal this information. Attached to the medical records were internal communications between senior palace officials, private secretaries, and government representatives discussing how to manage the public narrative. The phrase "died peacefully" had been deliberately chosen to avoid questions about suffering or medical interventions. The decision to list old age as the cause of death had been made at the highest levels, with the actual medical details sealed and classified. The Guardian contacted Buckingham Palace for comment before publishing, as journalistic protocol required. The palace's initial response was a terse no comment, followed within an hour by a call from the King's private secretary requesting that publication be delayed pending a formal statement. But Mitchell and her editors knew that once the palace was aware they had the documents, there would be immediate efforts to suppress the story through legal means or political pressure. The decision was made to publish immediately. The article went live on The Guardian's website at 6 p.m. on December 5th. Within minutes, it was the most read story on the internet, shared millions of times across social media platforms, picked up by news outlets around the world. The headline was stark and uncompromising. Palace concealed true cause of Queen's death, leaked documents reveal. The story laid out the medical facts, included images of key documents with identifying information redacted to protect sources, and raised pointed questions about who had authorized the deception and why. Buckingham Palace issued an emergency statement 2 hours after publication. The statement acknowledged that medical privacy considerations had informed decisions about what information to share publicly regarding Her late Majesty's demise. It stated that the characterization of the Queen's passing as peaceful was accurate in the sense that she had not been in pain during her final hours thanks to appropriate palliative care. It claimed that the listing of old age as cause of death was medically appropriate for someone of her advanced years and was consistent with standard practice. But the statement conspicuously did not deny the accuracy of the leaked documents. The careful wording of the palace statement only fueled more questions and more outrage. If the documents were fake, the palace would have said so directly and threatened legal action against the publication. The fact that they had not done so was taken as confirmation that the leaked information was substantially accurate. The monarchy had lied, or at the very least had engaged in a systematic campaign of misdirection about the circumstances of the Queen's demise. And now, more than 3 years later, that deception was being exposed. By midnight, government officials were being pulled into the crisis. Members of Parliament from multiple parties were demanding answers. The Prime Minister's office issued a statement saying the government had not been involved in decisions about medical information regarding the late Queen, a claim that contradicted the leaked documents which clearly showed government officials participating in discussions about narrative management. The story was spiraling into a full-blown constitutional crisis, with questions not just about what happened to the Queen, but about who could be trusted to tell the truth. Social media erupted with anger and conspiracy theories. Hashtags calling for transparency and accountability trended worldwide. People who had mourned the Queen, who had waited in line for hours to file past her coffin, who had felt connected to her final journey, now felt betrayed and manipulated. The carefully orchestrated pageantry of her death and funeral, which had been meant to honor her and unite the nation, now felt tainted by deception. Trust in the monarchy, already fragile for many, took a devastating hit. The journalist Sarah Mitchell, thrust suddenly into the center of an international story, gave an interview explaining how she had verified the documents and why The Guardian had decided to publish, despite knowing it would enrage the palace. She spoke about the public's right to know, about the importance of truth, even when that truth was uncomfortable, about how the monarchy could not demand trust while concealing basic facts about major events. Her defense of the publication was passionate and articulate, and it resonated with millions who felt the same sense of betrayal. As the night wore on and the story dominated every news cycle, one thing became clear. The revelation about Queen Elizabeth's demise was not just about correcting the historical record. It was about exposing a pattern of deception, a willingness by the institution to lie to the public when the truth seemed inconvenient or difficult. And it raised an unavoidable question that would haunt the monarchy going forward. If they lied about this, what else had they lied about? The cover-up was exposed, and the damage to the crown's credibility might be impossible to repair. The official story unravels. The narrative that the British public had been given in September 2022 had been carefully constructed to convey dignity, peace, and natural conclusion. On the morning of September 8th, the palace had released a statement saying that doctors were concerned for Her Majesty's health and that she remained under medical supervision at Balmoral. By early afternoon, news broke that senior royals were traveling to Scotland to be with her. By evening, the announcement came that the Queen had died peacefully that afternoon, with King Charles and Princess Anne by her side. The timeline had always contained oddities that royal watchers had noted, but that had been explained away or dismissed. Prince William, Prince Andrew, Prince Edward, and Sophie had all traveled to Scotland together on a private flight, arriving at Balmoral in the early afternoon. But Prince Harry had traveled separately and had not arrived until after his grandmother's demise. The official explanation was logistical difficulties in coordinating travel, but it had seemed strange that Harry alone had been unable to get there in time. The leaked documents now revealed why. The Queen had actually died at 4:14 p.m., not the 2:37 p.m. that was initially reported. The earlier time had been used to suggest that Charles and Anne had been present when she passed, creating the image of children at their mother's bedside. In reality, based on the medical notes, the Queen's demise had come after a period where she was unconscious and unresponsive, with multiple family members present but unable to communicate with her. The timing had been altered in the official record to fit the preferred narrative. Even more troubling was what the documents revealed about the days leading up to September 8th. The Queen had appeared publicly on September 6th, meeting with the new Prime Minister Liz Truss in what would be her final official duty. Photographs from that meeting had shown the Queen looking frail but present, standing in the drawing room at Balmoral. What those photographs had not shown was that the meeting had been kept deliberately brief because the Queen was already experiencing symptoms that her doctors found concerning. According to the medical notes, the Queen had been complaining of severe headaches and episodes of confusion in the days before the stroke. Her personal physician had been monitoring her closely and had expressed concern about cardiovascular issues that were not being adequately managed. The decision to proceed with the Prime Minister meeting had been controversial among her medical team, with at least one doctor arguing that she should be in hospital for observation, not conducting official business. But the Queen had insisted, and those around her had deferred to her wishes, as they always had. The stroke had occurred on the evening of September 5th, roughly 36 hours before the public was first told there were health concerns. The Queen had been found unconscious in her bedroom by a member of staff who had gone to check on her when she failed to appear for dinner. Emergency protocols had been immediately activated. Her personal physician had been with her within minutes. Additional specialists had been summoned from Aberdeen and Edinburgh. Prince Charles, as he then was, had been contacted immediately and had arrived at Balmoral within hours. What followed was a 72-hour vigil as doctors worked to stabilize the Queen while knowing the prognosis was grim. The stroke had been massive, affecting large portions of her brain. She had been placed on supportive care, medications to manage blood pressure and prevent additional strokes, but there was no realistic hope of recovery. The family had been told to come, that the end was near, but the exact timing was uncertain. She could linger for days or could pass within hours. The decision to keep all of this secret from the public for days had been made collectively by senior royals and palace officials. The reasoning, according to the documents, was to allow the family time to gather, to say goodbye, without the media frenzy that would accompany any announcement of a serious health crisis. They wanted privacy for those final hours, wanted to control the narrative and the timing. The public notification that doctors were concerned came only on the morning of September 8th, when it became clear that death was imminent and could no longer be concealed. The palace photographer who had been scheduled to document the Queen's final weeks at Balmoral had been turned away on September 6th with no explanation. The photographer, who had worked with the royal family for decades, had found the dismissal unusual and had later learned from staff that there were strict orders that no images were to be taken of the Queen after September 6th. The leaked documents suggested this was because her appearance and condition would have made clear that she was gravely ill, contradicting the desired narrative of a woman who had simply grown tired and slipped away. Staff members at Balmoral had been present throughout the ordeal, caring for the Queen, supporting the family, witnessing the medical crisis. They had been required to sign expanded non-disclosure agreements in the days following the Queen's demise, threatening severe legal and financial consequences for anyone who discussed what they had witnessed. Several staff members had expressed discomfort with what they viewed as a cover-up. But the pressure to remain silent had been intense, and most had complied out of loyalty or fear. The gaps in the official record were numerous once you knew to look for them. The death certificate signed by the Queen's physician listed old age as the cause, but contained no mention of stroke or organ failure. Medical privacy laws gave the palace significant discretion about what to disclose, and that discretion had been used to maximum effect. The official statements had used phrases like "passed peacefully" and "with family" that were technically defensible, but that painted a picture very different from the medical reality of stroke, unconsciousness, and mechanical support. Members of the household who had served the Queen for years later admitted privately to friends that the official narrative had troubled them. They felt the Queen deserved for her final fight to be acknowledged, that her strength in facing death should not be sanitized into a fairy tale of gentle sleep. But they also understood the palace's reasoning, the desire to protect her dignity and to avoid traumatizing a public that loved her. The tension between truth and kindness, between transparency and privacy, had been resolved in favor of a managed narrative that now looked increasingly like a calculated deception. As these details emerged from the leaked documents and from sources willing to speak now that the cover-up had been exposed, the official story of Queen Elizabeth's demise collapsed entirely. It had not been peaceful in the medical sense, though palliative care had ensured she was not in pain. It had not been sudden, but rather the conclusion of days of crisis. It had not been simply old age, but specific catastrophic medical events. Every element of the story the public had been told was either incomplete, misleading, or demonstrably false. The question now was why the palace had felt the need to lie, and whether anyone would be held accountable for the deception. What really happened at Balmoral? The medical records painted a detailed and devastating picture of the Queen's final 72 hours. At approximately 8:45 p.m. on September 5, 2022, Her Majesty failed to appear for dinner as expected. Lady Susan Hussey, one of her longest-serving ladies-in-waiting, had gone to the Queen's private quarters to check on her and found her unconscious on the floor near her bed. She had apparently suffered the stroke while preparing for dinner and had collapsed, unable to call for help. The emergency response had been immediate and professional. Balmoral, like all royal residences, had detailed medical protocols in place for exactly such an event. The Queen's personal physician, who was in residence at the estate, was with her within 3 minutes. He quickly assessed that she had suffered a major stroke and began emergency treatment while calling for additional medical support. An ambulance with advanced life support capabilities was dispatched from Aberdeen, roughly 50 miles away, but the decision was quickly made that moving the Queen was too risky given her condition. Instead, medical equipment and personnel came to Balmoral. By midnight on September 5th, a full medical team including neurologists, cardiologists, and intensive care specialists had assembled at the estate. The Queen's bedroom had been effectively converted into a hospital room with monitors, IV equipment, and other necessary medical apparatus. The initial scans, done with portable equipment, confirmed the worst. She had suffered a massive hemorrhagic stroke affecting the right side of her brain, with significant bleeding and swelling. The medical team had explained to King Charles, who had arrived at Balmoral around 11 p.m., that his mother's condition was catastrophic and survival was unlikely. Even if she did survive the immediate crisis, the damage to her brain was so extensive that meaningful recovery was impossible. She was unconscious and unresponsive, kept alive by supportive care but unable to breathe effectively on her own. The decision facing the family was whether to pursue aggressive intervention, including possible transfer to hospital for surgery to relieve the pressure on her brain, or to focus on comfort care and allow nature to take its course. Charles, in consultation with Princess Anne, who had arrived shortly after him, made the decision that his mother would not want aggressive treatment that would only prolong dying without offering any hope of recovery. She had made her wishes clear in discussions over the years. She wanted dignity in death, not to be kept alive artificially beyond what was reasonable. The medical team was instructed to focus on keeping her comfortable, managing pain and agitation, but not to take heroic measures to extend her life. The next 48 hours were a vigil. Charles rarely left his mother's side, sitting with her, holding her hand, speaking to her even though she could not respond. Anne was similarly devoted, taking shifts so that the Queen was never alone. Other family members were contacted and began making their way to Scotland. The Queen's breathing was irregular, her vital signs unstable. Multiple times, the medical team thought the end was coming, only for her to stabilize again temporarily. Her heart was strong, one of the doctors noted in the records, even as her brain was failing. The decision to keep this crisis secret from the public was made on September 6th. Charles, now king, though not yet publicly, consulted with senior palace officials and government representatives about how to handle the situation. The consensus was that announcing the Queen's stroke and imminent death prematurely would create a media circus that would make the family's final hours with her unbearable. Better to wait, to allow the family to gather and say goodbye in private, and only then to inform the public when death was truly imminent. But keeping the secret required careful management. Staff at Balmoral had to be controlled, kept away from areas where they might see the medical crisis unfolding. The photographer was dismissed. Planned events were quietly cancelled without explanation. When the Prime Minister's office inquired about the Queen's health on September 6th, they were told only that she was resting and should not be disturbed, with no mention of the stroke or the medical team assembled at the estate. The Queen's actual death, when it came on the afternoon of September 8th, was both expected and shocking. Her breathing had become increasingly labored through the morning. Her blood pressure had dropped precipitously. The medical team had informed the family that death was likely within hours. Charles, Anne, Edward, and Andrew were all present, along with Sophie and several of the Queen's closest staff. William arrived around 2 p.m. The doctors had administered medication to ensure she remained comfortable and unaware, effectively sedating her to prevent any distress. At 4:14 p.m., Her Majesty's heart stopped. Resuscitation was not attempted, consistent with the family's wishes and the medical reality. The doctors confirmed death, and Charles broke down, the weight of losing his mother and inheriting the crown simultaneously overwhelming him in that moment. Anne held him as he wept, the formal protocols momentarily forgotten in the face of raw grief. The Queen had fought through the stroke for 72 hours, her body trying desperately to survive even as her brain failed, before finally surrendering. Harry arrived at Balmoral at 7:50 p.m., more than 3 hours after his grandmother's demise. The delay, according to sources close to him, was because he had not been told how serious the situation was until it was too late. While William had been informed on September 7th that he should come immediately, Harry had received his information later and had struggled to find transport to Scotland. By the time he arrived, the Queen was already gone, and Harry had broken down upon learning he had missed her by hours. The medical team remained at Balmoral through the evening, completing necessary paperwork, consulting with the coroner, preparing the body for the undertakers. The decision about what to list as cause of death had been made at the highest levels. Old age was vague enough to be defensible, medical enough to seem official, and benign enough to avoid difficult questions. The doctors had expressed some discomfort with the characterization, as medical professionals are trained to be specific about cause of death, but they ultimately deferred to the palace's wishes. The true story of what happened at Balmoral was one of a woman who had fought to the very end, whose body had tried to survive even a catastrophic stroke, who had been surrounded by family and medical professionals doing everything they could within the bounds of her own stated wishes. It was a story of difficult decisions, of balancing aggressive treatment against dignity and dying, of a family trying to say goodbye while managing their constitutional responsibilities. But it was not the peaceful, gentle passing that the public had been told about. It was a medical crisis, a death that took days to unfold, and a cover-up that began almost immediately. The cover-up begins. Within 2 hours of Queen Elizabeth's death, senior palace officials gathered in a sitting room at Balmoral to begin managing what they knew would be one of the most significant news events in British history. Present were the King's private secretary, the keeper of the Privy Purse, the palace communications director, and representatives from Downing Street. Their task was to craft a narrative that would inform the public of the Queen's death while protecting the family's privacy and maintaining the dignity of the occasion. The first decision made in that room was about timing. The Queen had died at 4:14 p.m., but the announcement would not be made until 6:30 p.m. This delay served multiple purposes. It allowed time for all immediate family members to be notified personally before learning from the media. It aligned with the evening news cycle, ensuring maximum viewership for the historic announcement. And it gave the team time to finalize the precise wording of the statement, and prepare for the logistical challenges that would follow. The wording of the death announcement was debated extensively. Every phrase was examined for implications and interpreted through multiple lenses. The decision to say the Queen died peacefully was deliberate. Medically, it was defensible because she had been sedated and pain-free at the moment of death, but it concealed the preceding days of the medical crisis. The phrase suggested a gentle slipping away, not a 72-hour struggle following a catastrophic stroke. It was, in the view of several people in that room, a compassionate lie meant to spare the public unnecessary distress. The timing discrepancy, listing her death as 2:37 p.m. rather than 4:14 p.m., was intended to suggest that Charles and Anne had been present when she passed. In reality, by 2:37 she was still alive, though deeply unconscious and declining rapidly. The actual moment of demise at 4:14 had more people present, but the earlier time created a more intimate and poignant image. The decision to alter the timeline was controversial, even among those crafting the narrative, but it was ultimately approved as a minor adjustment in service of a larger truth. The cause of death was the most sensitive decision. Medical professionals in the room argued for accuracy, suggesting that stroke should be listed as the immediate cause. But senior officials worried about the questions this would raise. When did the stroke occur? What symptoms had been missed? Why had the public not been told immediately? Old age was proposed as a simpler alternative, vague enough to encompass the reality that multiple systems had failed in a 96-year-old woman, but specific enough to seem like actual medical information. The Queen's personal physician agreed to list old age on the death certificate, though he privately expressed reservations about the lack of precision. Instructions went out to staff at Balmoral that evening regarding confidentiality. Existing non-disclosure agreements were invoked, and additional documents were prepared for key staff to sign. The language was stern and unambiguous, discussing any details of the Queen's final days beyond what was officially released would constitute a serious breach of trust and would result in immediate dismissal and possible legal action. Staff were told that they were protecting the Queen's dignity and the family's privacy, which was true, but they were also being asked to maintain a fiction about the nature of her death. Government involvement in shaping the narrative was more extensive than would later be acknowledged. The Prime Minister's office wanted to ensure that the monarchy's stability was not questioned during the transition. Cabinet members were briefed on the official story and asked to reinforce it in their public statements. The phrase "died peacefully" appeared in multiple ministerial statements within hours, a coordination that was not accidental. The government had a vested interest in a smooth succession and a united national response to the Queen's death, and that required controlling the narrative. Documents that contained the full medical details were immediately classified. The medical records, notes from the 72-hour crisis, communications between doctors and family, all were sealed with instructions that they not be released for 75 years, the standard period for sensitive royal documents. The assumption was that by then, everyone directly involved would be dead, and the truth would be historical curiosity rather than current controversy. But someone in that chain of document security had kept copies, and those copies had now found their way to a journalist. The palace photographer's dismissal on September 6th had been part of the cover-up's early stages. The images of the Queen meeting the Prime Minister on that day were carefully managed, with only certain angles and expressions allowed to be published. Photographs taken earlier in the week, showing the Queen looking more vigorous, were released instead of the September 6th images to create an impression of better health than existed. The visual narrative was being manipulated just as carefully as the verbal one. The briefings given to royal correspondents in the days following the Queen's death reinforced the official story. Reporters were told that the Queen's decline had been relatively sudden, a matter of days rather than weeks. They were given details about her final hours that emphasized peace and family presence. The correspondents, most of whom had long-standing relationships with palace officials and depended on those relationships for access, reported what they were told without significant skepticism. Why the lies? The question of why the palace chose to deceive the public about Queen Elizabeth's death had no single simple answer. The decision had been the product of multiple motivations, some understandable and even sympathetic, others more cynical and self-serving. Understanding those motivations required looking at the unique pressures facing the monarchy in September 2022 and the institutional instincts that had been developed over centuries of managing royal crises. The most charitable explanation was a genuine desire to protect the Queen's dignity and spare the public distressing details. Queen Elizabeth had been an intensely private person, despite spending 7 decades in the public eye. She had managed her public image carefully, showing strength and continuity even during difficult times. The idea that her final days would become fodder for tabloid speculation and medical analysis would have been anathema to her. The officials who made the decision to conceal the stroke and medical crisis believed they were honoring her wishes and her lifetime of service by presenting her death as peaceful and dignified rather than as a medical emergency. There was also genuine concern about public reaction. The Queen had been a stabilizing presence for so long that her death, under any circumstances, would be traumatic for many people. But a death from sudden catastrophic stroke, with days of unconsciousness and medical intervention, might be more than the collective psyche could easily process. The image of the Queen, strong and stoic until the end, slipping peacefully away in her sleep, was easier to accept than the reality of ambulances and emergency medical teams and a 3-day vigil as her body slowly shut down. The lie was meant to be kind, to give people a story they could cope with, rather than one that would haunt them. The constitutional dimension was also significant. King Charles was ascending to the throne at 73 years old after a lifetime as heir. Questions about his health, his readiness, his ability to reign for a meaningful period were already circulating. If the public knew that his mother had suffered a catastrophic stroke and had taken days to die despite intensive medical intervention, it might raise uncomfortable questions about the health of the royal family more broadly. Charles himself had been diagnosed with cancer less than 2 years into his reign. The decision to present the Queen's death as natural old age rather than acute medical crisis was partly about protecting Charles's early reign from additional scrutiny. The Commonwealth dimensions were real and pressing. Queen Elizabeth had been queen of 15 realms, and in several of those countries, particularly in the Caribbean, Republican movements had been gaining strength. The death of the long-reigning monarch was already going to trigger questions about whether these countries wanted to continue with Charles as their head of state. A messy, prolonged, medically complicated death might have strengthened the arguments of those who wanted to break ties with the monarchy. A peaceful, dignified passing allowed for a smoother transition and gave Charles the best possible chance of retaining the Commonwealth realms he had inherited. Media management was another factor. The palace had long been in an adversarial relationship with certain elements of the press, particularly tabloids that had caused pain to multiple members of the royal family over the years. The officials making decisions in September 2022 knew that if they revealed the stroke and the 3-day medical crisis, the tabloids would be relentless. Every detail would be picked over, medical experts would be brought in to speculate, there would be questions about whether the Queen had been properly cared for, whether warning signs had been missed. The family would have no peace during what was already the most difficult time of their lives. Controlling the narrative meant limiting what the media could exploit. There was also, less nobly, an element of institutional self-protection. The monarchy had been through a difficult period in the years leading up to the Queen's death. Prince Andrew's scandals, Harry and Meghan's departure and subsequent public accusations, questions about royal finances and the cost of the institution, all had damaged the Crown's reputation. The Queen's death and Charles's accession was a moment of transition when the institution was vulnerable. A clean, simple, dignified story about the Queen's passing helped to unify the country in mourning and reminded people of what the monarchy at its best represented. Any complications or controversies in the death narrative risked undermining that unifying moment. The precedent of royal deaths being sanitized was well established. King George VI's death in 1952 had been presented as occurring peacefully in his sleep, though medical records later showed he had died of a coronary thrombosis after extended illness. The fallout. Parliament convened an emergency session on December 6, 2025, less than 24 hours after The Guardian published its explosive revelation. The chamber was packed. Members from all parties united in their demand for answers about who had authorized the deception regarding Queen Elizabeth's death and why the public had been systematically misled. The tone was angry, the questions sharp, and the implications for the monarchy's relationship with democratic institutions were profound. The Prime Minister speaking first attempted to distance the government from the palace's decisions about what medical information to share publicly, but MPs immediately challenged this claim, pointing to the leaked documents that showed government officials participating in meetings where the narrative was crafted. The Prime Minister was forced to acknowledge that there had been consultation between palace and government, but maintained that final decisions about royal medical privacy rested with the palace, not with elected officials. This answer satisfied no one. Members from across the political spectrum expressed their sense of betrayal. Conservative MPs who had been loyal supporters of the monarchy spoke about the damage to public trust. Labor members demanded investigations into whether laws had been broken in the falsification or concealment of medical records. Liberal Democrat and SNP members used the scandal to renew calls for reconsidering the role of monarchy in a modern democracy. The consensus in the chamber was that something fundamental had been broken in the relationship between the crown and the people. Public outrage had been building throughout the day. Opinion polls conducted overnight showed that 74% of Britons felt they had been lied to about the Queen's death. 68% wanted a formal inquiry into who made the decision to conceal the true circumstances. 51%, a slim majority but a majority nonetheless, said the revelation had damaged their view of the monarchy as an institution. The numbers were devastating for King Charles, whose reign was already facing challenges and who now had to answer for deceptions made in his name, even if not entirely by his choice. Calls for investigations came from multiple quarters. The medical board that oversaw physicians was asked to review whether the listing of old age as cause of death violated professional standards requiring accuracy. The Information Commissioner was being pressured to examine whether the sealing of medical records had been an abuse of privacy laws. Legal experts debated whether anyone involved could be prosecuted for fraud or misconduct in public office. The appetite for accountability was enormous, but the mechanisms for holding royals and their officials accountable were murky at best. King Charles's credibility was suffering immensely. Even though the initial decisions had been made in the immediate aftermath of his mother's death, when he was grieving and perhaps not fully engaged in all aspects of crisis management, he was now the king and had allowed the deception to continue for more than 3 years. His statement on December 6th expressed regret for any hurt caused by the handling of information about his mother's death, but stopped short of admitting wrongdoing. The carefully lawyered language only intensified public anger. People wanted an apology, an acknowledgement that lying had been wrong, not more careful phrasing and institutional defensiveness. The impact on other royal deaths was immediately questioned. Prince Philip had died on April 2021, with the palace stating he had died peacefully at Windsor Castle. Now people wondered whether that death had also been sanitized, whether there were medical crises and complications that had been concealed. Princess Margaret's death in 2002, Queen Elizabeth the Queen Mother's death the same year, going back through decades of royal deaths, all were now being viewed with suspicion. Had the palace been systematically lying about how royals died? The erosion of trust was not limited to Queen Elizabeth's death, but extended to the entire modern history of the institution. International reaction was particularly harsh from the Commonwealth realms. The Governor-General of Canada issued a statement expressing disappointment at the lack of transparency. Australian Republican movements used the scandal as evidence that the monarchy was an outdated institution built on deception and should be abolished. Jamaica, already in the process of transitioning to republic status, pointed to the scandal as validation of their decision to remove the British monarch as head of state. The cover-up was accelerating the disintegration of the Commonwealth realm structure. Within the royal family, there was reportedly significant tension about how to respond. Prince William was said to be furious that his grandmother's demise had been handled in a way that now tarnished her memory and damaged the institution she had served so faithfully. He had apparently not been fully briefed on the extent of the concealment at the time and felt betrayed by his own family's officials. Harry, speaking from California, released a statement expressing his lack of surprise at the revelation, noting that lack of transparency and honesty had been among his reasons for leaving royal life. The question of transparency going forward became unavoidable. Could the monarchy continue to operate with the level of secrecy around health and personal matters that it had historically maintained? In an age of digital records, whistleblowers, and public expectations of openness, the old model seemed unsustainable. But royals also had legitimate privacy rights, and the alternative of every medical detail becoming public knowledge had its own problems. Finding a new balance would require difficult conversations and possibly formal changes to how royal information was managed. The new transparency might need to be forced upon the monarchy rather than voluntarily adopted. Parliament began discussing legislation that would require greater disclosure around royal deaths, possibly mandating that death certificates list actual medical causes rather than vague terms like old age. There were proposals for independent oversight of royal medical information, taking decisions about what to disclose out of the hands of palace officials who had clear conflicts of interest. The monarchy might find itself subject to transparency requirements it had never faced before. The permanent damage to the institution's relationship with truth was perhaps the most serious long-term consequence. Trust, once lost, is extraordinarily difficult to rebuild. Every future statement from the palace would now be viewed through the lens of this scandal. When officials said a royal was in good health, people would wonder what was being concealed. When causes of death were listed, there would be skepticism about accuracy. The currency of the monarchy had always been public trust and affection, and that currency had been devalued significantly by the revelation that officials had lied about something as fundamental as how the beloved Queen had passed away. As December 6th turned to December 7th, with the scandal dominating every news cycle and showing no signs of abating, it became clear that this was a watershed moment for the British monarchy. The institution would survive. It had survived worse, but it would not emerge unchanged. The era of unquestioned deference, of accepting palace statements at face value, of trusting that the monarchy had the public's best interests at heart, that era was over. A new relationship would need to be forged, one based on genuine transparency and accountability rather than carefully managed narratives and compassionate lies. Whether the monarchy was capable of that transformation remained an open question, but the alternative was continued erosion of public trust until the institution became unsustainable. The cover-up had been exposed, the damage was done, and the only path forward was truth, however uncomfortable that truth might be. The lies have been revealed, the cover-up was exposed, and the British monarchy stands on the precipice of a reckoning it can no longer avoid. Queen Elizabeth deserved better than to have her death become a scandal. Now the institution she served for 7 decades must face the consequences of choosing fiction over truth.